There's a lot of highly engaged and talented people in this world as well that we draw on. And that's a huge offering that cities have for us, being able to collaborate and really draw out and draw on our ingenuity to be able to deliver more with less.
Are you interested in the benefits of investing in public transport? What do you think about design by democracy? How can we create heterogeneous cities with infrastructure as the backbone? Stay tuned for answers from Sarah Bridges.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today I will interview Sarah Bridges, Technical Director at Aurecon and Director of Precinct Planning within the AJM Joint Venture. We will talk about her vision for the future of cities, public transport, removing bad solutions, collision of ideas, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Sarah Bridges is an accomplished project director with urban design and architectural background, specializing in complex urban projects that prioritize sustainability and community connectivity. As technical director at Aurecon and director of precinct planning within the AJM Joint Venture, she plays a pivotal role in shaping city infrastructure and urban renewal projects across Victoria. With expertise in place-based outcomes, she leads multidisciplinary teams to deliver high-profile public and private projects from business case development through to implementation. Passionate about empowering communities, Sarah is dedicated to designing urban environments that support low-carbon living and enhance people's ability to connect with their surroundings. And with that, Sarah, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
Fanny, it's so great to be here and to have such an open and interesting question. It's such a simple question. So thank you for inviting me to the podcast, and thank you for all the effort that you've gone through over the last couple of years to bring a group of people together that are interested and passionate about this topic. I see this question from a couple of different perspectives. Future is the one word that jumps out, and cities, obviously. I'm a big fan of sci-fi. When I see this question, I go down both the utopian and the dystopian route. And I know that we sit somewhere in between on that spectrum in reality, because we've got all these different forces that are brought into the cities, that are manifested into the cities. And our cities are these mirrors of these forces being manifested in real life. That's why I think most people are fascinated by them around the world. That's why we travel, we sightsee, we go to understand how other people live and how other people interact with each other. I had listened to podcasts in the past, and there is one person who talks about cities being a collision of people and a collision of ideas, a collision of all sorts of environmental, political and social ideas and issues coming together. And that really resonated with me. I really enjoyed that simple description of things. The future for cities, I think it's in between on that spectrum somewhere, depending on what forces are coming. I think we see at the geopolitical level changes. Some are good and some are going backwards. And my hope is that we continue on the progressive path to be able to continue to grow and really embed the ingenuity of humans into our cities on a day-to-day basis. I really see the future of cities. There's many ways to think about it. And I think sometimes in literature, the abstraction of the absurd in sci-fi can be really instructive. So I really enjoy that side of things. They're also essential. We understand that cities create a habitat for humans to live that is more sustainable if it is compact, if cities are delivered in the right way. So if we are going to continue on our trajectory of growth as a human population and as one biological form on this planet, cities are really essential to be able to sustain that life. I think they can't continue to grow in the way that they have in the past. We've got to learn from the past. We've got to understand what the limits of growth really are and double down on some of the sustainable development ideas and policies and innovations that we've been able to come up with over the past 50, 60 years.
Thank you for describing the city itself, because your description, which you got from other literature, the collision of people and ideas, it's a fascinating one. What are the forces, in your understanding, which influence the city?
Social, political, environmental. They're all interconnected as well. So how do we respond to our changing environment when climate change is an immediate issue? How do we come together as a social group to be able to drive decision-making that is right for us, not only in the short, but also in the medium and the long term? I think sometimes we are distracted by short-term gains and we're not necessarily looking towards the long-term future. And I think that plays out on all sorts of different projects at different scales. We are making decisions around cost and value. What's the immediate cost and what is the long-term value? And so I think these are some of the issues that we're looking for. There are a number of forces, like I said, the social, political, environmental. You can break these down. I was a student at University of Melbourne in the last year of my architecture studies, and I was taught by Steve Whitford, one of the lecturers there, and he had an approach to urban design which layered out, I think it was 14 forces of the city. So it was about context, it was about land use, it was about environmental issues and overlays, really a number of the environmental and urban planning issues that you deal with across projects. It was a literal translation of how do you overlay the forces. If you map every force out, you separate them out, and then you can get this overlay of what does that mean on the actual city. Sometimes that turned into, okay, let's overlay them and then extrude the leftover space for the buildings. And there wasn't actually a lot of leftover space when you put all of those forces in there. So you had to be quite creative. And I think that's part of our role in the design and built environment industry, is to be creative within that contested space within the city. We have limited resources, and being able to understand which forces are the main forces that you need to respond to. And like I said, you need to respond in short, medium and long-term timeframes and understand that a project will evolve over time. And so sometimes the short-term needs of social, political, environmental forces are so strong that you really need to deliver on those. When the opportunities come to, in the medium, say 10 to 15 years, and the long-term 50 to 100 years, what will the project or what will our impact on our built environment be? Being able to answer that question is critical to be able to have a successful approach to how we develop our cities into the future.
You said social, political, and environmental, not economic.
That is a good point, and it should be in there. I think that essentially our economic viability, our economic stability, it's integrated into social, political, and environmental. You can't really separate that out. It's just an underlining need. That's one of the key structures of the way that we've developed and the way that cities are created. Being able to understand your investment and your funding pipelines and draw on those in a sustainable way is really important. And I know that the requirements around the economic stability are extremely important in driving success in cities. The economic process is still so heavily influenced by social, economic, and political forces themselves. There is a bit of overlap. There's definitely overlap.
It's very interesting that you made economics as the baseline, as the basis for these forces to interact with each other. I'm curious because you have been talking about sustainability. Usually sustainability is highlighted with the 3 sustainability pillars: economic, environmental, and social. That's why I asked, especially why economics weren't in the forces you mentioned. What does sustainability mean to you?
That's a very broad question. Sustainability to me in the context of cities means a mixture of meeting the needs of biological forms on our planet. And that means that sometimes the needs of the human race take precedence, and sometimes the needs of green infrastructure or our flora or fauna need to take the precedence. And so a sustainable approach to cities is understanding where the focus should be at any certain time. It's also understanding that things change over time, and adaptability should be included in all of our thinking around cities. So to me, I could go on about the general rules about sustainability and talk about giving back to our environment, etc. But I think the bigger picture idea is really understanding what form do you prioritize at what time within a project, and how do you ensure adaptability down the line? Because things change. We know that significantly. So from an economic sustainability perspective, COVID was a massive change to our cities. The city of Melbourne had a huge decrease in its footfall on the streets, in its retail offering. It created a lot of closures. It's changed the way companies do business, how they invite their employees into the city. There's a lot of incentivization that's come out of that. And that's something that you can't foresee, but being able to be adaptable to that, maybe not foresee it, but be adaptable in the moment, has been extremely important. So to be able to really deliver on that example, impact of COVID on our cities, we relied on our technological and our social abilities to be able to get through it. People moving to online work where they could. The rules around distance from each other, keeping a distance from each other, we in most parts kept. That was an important and understood part of our response and adaptable response. So the resilience in a city that is driving towards a sustainable outcome really relies on a number of these kind of forces still. I guess we come back to that again. I think the ability to be able to implement policies that drive green infrastructure improvements are critical as well. We know that urban heat island effect has long-term health and well-being issues within our communities, particularly in cities where the urban heat is magnified. And so how do we have policies to try and mitigate that? Cities aren't perfect, obviously. They're carbon intensive, and they're to be innovative and be able to drive policies that can fix some of the problems that they create as well.
I will poke a bit around sustainability, because you mentioned in your answer sustainability, resilience, and adaptability. And those can be very different things. And I personally have a turbulent relationship with sustainability, because if we go back to the root of the word itself, it means to sustain. And I am questioning whether we want to sustain our current systems, our current approaches, our current social, economic, and environmental and political systems. On the other hand, if we would go to resilience, that at least creates some buffer to the shocks we face. And to be honest, personally, I would go even further to adaptability and another term called anti-fragility, where the systems learn from the shocks and they become better for them, not just survive them. So I'm curious how you think about these terms and whether this kind of approach to sustainability means anything to you.
In the work that I've done and in the projects that I've seen, adaptability and resilience are critical. Having looked at a lot of large infrastructure projects that are 50, 100-year type projects, sometimes never getting realised and sometimes getting realised, they being able to define what you think the future is going to hold and what the best outcome in that future scenario could be is a really fascinating process to go through. I think it also draws out a number of different ideals around sustainability, around adaptability and resilience. For different disciplines, it means different things. And I find that the moment of bringing teams together where you're discussing requirements around sustainability, sometimes it can be quite narrow and be Green Star rated buildings, for example. That's really important, don't get me wrong, but it's a relatively narrow impact on the city. And then it can be quite broad when it comes to green infrastructure policies, tree canopy requirements. Then it can be even broader again when it comes to public transport investment, as opposed to investing in roads. You need a healthy balance of the two because of the way that we've developed with our technologies. But according to research, one of the major impacts of creating a more sustainable, resilient and adaptable city is investment in public transport. You give people choice, and with choice, you give the chance for behaviour change. And within our cities, that's one of the major contributors that we can have to a sustainable future. I'm a big fan of Saul Griffith's Electrify Everything. And in that, he has this very simple idea that We do need to target the big issues like generation of energy, switching from coal to renewable energy. But he also says the power is in the suburbs. If you can reach out to the people that are living in the suburbs, the people that are living in the cities connected to those suburbs, for me, suburbs are part of a city. If you can really reach out and resonate and have this conversation and get behavior change at that scale, that's where you will get a real impact. And I find that fascinating. I think he's got a number of graphs that you can see throughout his book that show if everyone just switched their household goods, all of your white goods in your house, to electric goods, go from a petrol-powered lawnmower to an electric-powered lawnmower. Those types of small changes, they do actually make a difference en masse, on scale. And that's the power of collective intent within a city, is that you can drive towards this sustainable but also resilient and adaptable future. I think the word anti-fragility that you've mentioned, that is a really interesting one. Does it not tie back to sustainability though? Or does it say that our current existence is very fragile?
It applies that our current existence, our current systems, and our current thinking is fragile because if some shocks happen, then the system just fall apart. With sustainability, some could argue that we want to put back the system to the same instead of improving on the system, instead of understanding why the shock happens and then creating something better. Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about this anti-fragile approach in his book titled Anti-Fragile. And he talks about that we can create anti-fragile systems if we allow small shocks to happen, because then we learn how to handle shocks. While in the sustainable approach, I think that we are not allowing even the small shocks to happen, to learn how to handle the shocks. And then something huge happens, and then we are just, no, can't handle this at all. So that's why, for example, I think anti-fragility, it's a much better approach for communities, for cities, for systems, because it allows for the adaptability, for even resilience, but it's so much more than resilience for me.
I'm racking my mind trying to think, where have we inherently taken on anti-fragile thinking?
For example, my partner is a computer scientist and he works with developing programs. That's a very broad description of his work, so please bear with me. But when he creates those programs, for example, the feedback loops are so much faster than in the built environment. They have maybe 2 weeks runs when they create something, give the client that something, and the client gives feedback. They use it, they break it, and then they immediately start upgrading it. Software development is a much more anti-fragile thinking than the built environment, the building industry itself. From the building industry, I think multifunctional spaces have this kind of thinking that Paul Satour talked about on the podcast, that creating playgrounds which can also function as water catchments when there is huge floods or huge rainfalls, they can work not just as one function, but they can also have the city itself function in a shock, in a disaster. And that's a question for me as well, how we can create anti-fragile cities. But I think there are aspects which could be translated or just utilized better for the city to make it step by step more and more anti-fragile.
I'd say that I was probably jumping forward a bit. In terms of opportunities for the city, it is really around doing more with less. It is about those multifunctional spaces. It is about being able to adapt to events, but also be a high-value offering, high-value, high-amenity offering in our public spaces, in our buildings, in our transport networks on a day-to-day basis as well. So that multifunctionality is pretty important to a sustainable development outcome and really would probably meet some of those anti-fragility approaches. I think if we can use up less space, less money, less impact, if we came at projects in that way and at the way that we approach our city, you'll start to get more equality, more choice, more positive change. And that more with less approach, there's a lot to that. There's a lot of highly engaged and talented people in this world as well that we draw on. And that's a huge offering that cities have for us. being able to collaborate and really draw out and draw on our ingenuity to be able to deliver more with less. That's one of the goals that we should all be driving towards. I think it would be awesome if that was the force, that was the key force of our, and I'm sounding like a bit Star Warsy here, but if that was the force that we drew on, because there's a lot to gain out of that. Not only do we draw on our knowledge economy, we draw on our ability to collaborate together, we also get the most out of our spaces that we have, our public spaces and our buildings that we're creating.
You mentioned ingenuity. What does ingenuity mean to you?
Ingenuity is, collaboration is key to ingenuity. I think there's not one mastermind that can come to the table and solve the problems. There's got to be collaborative effort. And in my experience, it's bringing teams together and bringing the right people to the table at the right time is extremely important. Ingenuity comes when, and it often comes out of necessity, they say, but it also comes when people come together and have a clear purpose and a clear goal. If you can set that purpose, the goals, and some of the key actions that you're trying to achieve to get to that end point as a team with the collective knowledge to a better outcome, I think that's where true ingenuity really comes to the table. It's focusing on a problem with a collective mindset or a collective group of people and being able to play out different scenarios and then drive towards a positive change.
We interviewed Chiara Marletto in episode 308. She is a theoretical physicist and she works with quantum science, quantum theory, and quantum gravity. And it was part of the podcast Turn 2025, where we highlight a specific charity. And Chiara is working on proving or disproving that gravity has quantum effects. This whole thing is connected to your answer in a way that she talked about that when a physicist is led to their devices to think about whatever, then they will find something truly different. That's how quantum theory came to mind. That's how the physicist found the atoms, how they really were. And she talked about when we have a specific goal in mind, as you mentioned, we are not necessarily allow ourselves and allow our creativity to find big solutions, just iterative solutions. So I'm curious whether you think that ingenuity really can manifest in a setting where there is a clear goal, there is a clear problem, probably the clear problem helps, but when there is a clear goal, narrowing the thinking, I'm curious, what is your experience with that?
Honestly, I don't have that much experience with that setting because of the work that I do. It's very task-based in some ways. City requires more public transport. Okay, deliver more public transport. And whilst my experience isn't really there, I think it makes absolute sense that you've got to allow for that goal to shift. You've got to allow for what the outcomes are to shift. I still believe that the purpose needs to be pretty clear. So even with an open mind, even with a clean slate, a blank page, you still need to have a clear purpose of why. I'm not sure what started the discovery of atoms, but I'm sure that the question of why was there. Why are things the way they are? It maybe is not necessarily how can I impact that, but why are they the way they are? Find out that, and then, now we understand that. What can we do better? Or how can we harness this knowledge? That, I think, is part of the innovative process as well. So whilst I agree a blank page is a great way to be able to harness our ability to think beyond our borders, the purpose still needs to be there. And I think that is shared with all disciplines, with all sectors.
I agree. The why is very important. You also talked about long-term thinking, and you talked about the long-term thinking and also the cost and value pairs in a development, in a project. In my experience, the costs in such developments are usually at the forefront, or we think about the forefront costs, which would take maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years of development. But then we are not really thinking about the 50 years which comes out of the development itself. I'm curious, what do you think, why we don't really factor into our thinking this kind of long-term thinking, which will influence the whole project, the whole cost with the value itself, and how can we do it better?
I wish I was the point that could say this is how to do it. I think it's a contention within all cities, not only cities, states, countries, geopolitical issues. It's also a contention down to a decision from somebody renovating their bathroom. Do you get the $20 a square meter benchtop, or do you get the $120 a square meter benchtop? One you'll probably have to replace sooner than the other. And so there's an understanding that we all have our limits. Again, goes back to that, the forces. What are the limits that you're dealing with at the time? The cost versus value conversation comes up really often on projects. So I don't agree with you that we don't think that way. We actually do think that way. We do think that way in terms of creating business cases that have to go towards infrastructure projects. They are obviously contentious documents within our environment, particularly in Australia. The whole role of those documents is to say, what is the cost now, but what is the future benefit? And some projects go out to 20 years, some go out to 50, some go beyond that. I was talking to one of our transport planners just yesterday, and he was talking about projects that go out to 2080, I think it was, for the transport networks, understanding what the growth needs would be within Melbourne. Let me double check that date. But this long-term thinking that's applied to transport planning is fascinating. They have to take into account population growth. They have to take into account then density distribution of that population growth. Where will we grow up, or will we just grow out continuously? What's the employment opportunities? So how do we ensure that some parts of our city are still dedicated to industry? How are we ensuring that we're still dedicating agricultural space for food production? They have to take into account all of these things. And I'd say that the granularity of the data is good within cities because it's a known entity. It gets less and less easy to understand that data the further out from the city you go, because that's where there's less known activities of what would happen on the fringes and how we may or may not grow.
It's so reassuring that you said that you really think about the values. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
When I say that we think about it, we do think about it, but do we act on it on a day-to-day basis? Not so well. I've been in many a conversation where we've made compromise, and the compromises come from one of those forces bubbling up and being louder than the long-term benefits. And so the ability for us to be able to compromise, that's how we're made. We compromise all the time. That almost defines us as human beings in some ways, I believe. From an identity perspective, how you deal with your compromises is pretty important. It's the same with cities. How cities deal with their compromises is critical. Do they compromise understanding that the compromise will have just a short-term impact, or will that compromise have a long-term impact? And being able to describe that and negotiate that on a day-to-day basis is pretty important. And I think that's where having the right people at the table at the right time is really important. As I say, no one person can solve those problems. You really need to be able to have a robust and constructive conversation when you get to that point of compromise. It's all good and well to say, here's our purpose. Getting to that purpose is only good as the implementation plan. That implementation plan is only as good as our ability to collaborate and constructively compromise as we go along.
Thank you for the addition, because it's good to think, but it's also very important whether we act on the values or the thinking itself. You talked about this long-term thinking, for example, in transport projects. And I'm curious, when you think in such long terms, how do you create the vision? Because past experiences showed us that if we rely solely on the data, on the historical data, that here we will have population growth, that means that we will need more roads. That means that when we build the more roads, we just create more traffic, which creates just more traffic jams, which also needs that we need more roads. So it's a self-reinforcing feedback loop, which might not create the future we really want. How can we have an evidence-based thinking about the long term while not necessarily being dictated by the historical data?
The creation of visions for projects, for policy, for political platforms, even I would say, it's a bit of an art. I think the main point is that, and again, I'll come back to the point about inclusion and having a diverse set of voices that feel included and empowered at the table. You can't really get to a vision as a single entity. You need to draw on the collective understanding of what the future goals are. So I think there's a number of projects, there's a number of developments that have happened where a vision has been set and it's been done in a silo and it hasn't been successful. Those projects or those interventions, let's say, where collective intent has been manifested in a vision, where that set of diverse, included but empowered voices have developed and created those visions, that's where you see a more successful approach and more long-term thinking. It can be both ways. Design by democracy is a fascinating field in many ways because democracy means that there's equal representation, ideally, but our social construct and our social dynamic as humans, there is no equality. It's very difficult to create level playing field when you are negotiating on future thinking. And so I think that's one of our major challenges, is to find that inclusive way of developing our cities and empowering set of diverse voices that can bring a lot of short, medium and long-term value to our solution. So that's one side of it. I think the diversity and the right people at the table at the right time. I think the other side is learning from the past. We need to be able to really understand what we've done in the past and that data, understand that data, critically engage with that data, and then project that out to the future. If we continue, and this may go to your contentious view on sustainability, but if we continue on the trajectory of our past, what does that mean? We don't want to go for BAU. We don't want to do that. We want to go for better. Being able to understand our context and the history of place and the growth patterns, morphologies of cities, etc., how we've created what we've got today, critically engage with that, pick out the good bits, throw away the bad bits, and go on from there. That's what would be great. And I think that's where visions can be very successful. And that's generally, from my experience, what you try to do. You try to say there is value in place. We're not doing everything new. We're doubling down on the good stuff. And we're trying to remove the bad behaviors, the things that we've become addicted to. We're trying to tone them down and then turn up the dial to 11 on our sustainable futures.
I love that you just brought in removing the bad behaviors, because Karl Popper is a huge thinker on democracy. And he says that democracy is the collective action of removing bad policies and bad actors. Not who we rule, not what kind of policies we need, what policies, what rules, what bad actors should be removed for a better future, for a better collaboration, for a better community. So I love that you brought that in. Started to talk about this, but what are the three biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
I think going backwards. Going backwards would be one of my major fears. I think we can learn from our past. I think there's things that we've done in our past which are great and we should be moving them forward, but there are things that we should be really learning from. So going backwards is probably one of my biggest fears. I think we're seeing trends just recently in reversing some diversity and inclusion policies. We're seeing trends in an approach to climate change, which could be going backwards as well. We're seeing trends in dumb densification, is what I would say. And I think that they're the key things for me. Going backwards on climate change, going backwards on inclusive and equitable policies to be able to have all voices engaged in our cities, and growing out instead of growing up as a city. That's a fear that I have. The economic cost of growing out, we know that it costs about 25% more to develop outside of the established areas. The social and well-being impacts that has with isolation, loneliness and disconnectivity. And then the environmental cost conversion of agricultural land or green space or the green wedge in Melbourne's case into urban settings is not necessarily the right answer, particularly if it's low density.
You are talking about inclusion and diversity and bringing in all of the voices. What does this mean? An equal outcome, an equal opportunity, or something else?
Recognition of the fact that it is not a level playing field that we live in. There are people that do not benefit in the same way others do, just from where they were born, their physical abilities, their physical or mental state. There is a need to understand that we have a role as society to create a level playing field. And that's not only through policies, social policies, that's also through how we build our cities. We need to understand that you need to invite everybody out onto the street. Everyone wants to see a version of themselves to feel safe and included on the streets. I, as a woman, won't turn up to parts of the city which are not necessarily safe and inclusive for me. I just will avoid them. And that's a shame. That's a shame for all sorts of reasons. I think there are people that are representing a different intersection of our society that should have a space within our city. And I'm not sure that we fully allow for that or we fully engage with that at the moment.
How can we help individuals find their playing field and at the same time help cities keep their character? I talked with Amir Hussain, who talked about that in Bradford, there is a very strong cultural presence of his heritage, for example. But he also wants to have inclusive communities and inclusive places. And we discussed that, yes, that sounds good, but his culture is not necessarily inclusive in a sense that everybody can do whatever they want. And it has value because it has history, it has people respecting that culture, living in that culture, while at the same time, it would be also great to have inclusive communities, inclusive places where everybody can feel at home. How can we level that opposition?
I think this is a really good question. It's sometimes the moment that people get tripped up on. And I have that also. I think a level playing field, it shouldn't mean a homogenous existence or a homogenous city. It should really mean a heterogeneous city. We should be allowing for diverse character and representations and amplifications of diverse characters within different parts of our cities. I think you've got to ensure that the base infrastructure, the core infrastructure, the trunk infrastructure is there to be able to enable various groups of people, various activities to flourish, and not necessarily bind them to the fact that they have to be everything to everyone all the time. I think that's the role of infrastructure. That's where the level playing field, from what I engage with on a day-to-day basis, trunk infrastructure in cities is critical to be able to get that heterogeneous outcome and be able to ensure that our multicultural society has a safe space somewhere within the city, and it doesn't have to be everywhere because we will have conflict. There is conflict in our cultures, there's conflict in religion, there's conflict in our political beliefs, etc. And I don't think it means that every part of the city needs to be the same. I think sometimes we have to be honest with ourselves and say, this part of the city is really valuable to this activity or to this cultural existence. Let's really amplify that and make sure that is a safe and inclusive space for that type of activity to occur. It's a very good question because whilst I want it to be a level playing field, and I think infrastructure plays a critical role in creating that level playing field, we've also got to ensure that the diverse experiences can occur in a safe and highly amplified space. We benefit from that. When we have street festivals, when we have cultural festivals. In Melbourne, we're extremely lucky that we've got a highly interconnected arts and sports precinct that is walkable from the centre of the city. It's walkable and connected by trains and public transport as well. And that allows for this collision of cultures, this collision of values. And you'll be coming out of the NGV and you'll be hit by a crowd of footy players or footy fans. This is such a fascinating part of our city, that little corner of the city.
It's a really good example of how the collision of cultures can be present in the city. I would assume that the infrastructure you talked about as the backbone of allowing these differences flourish would be an opportunity for cities. So what are the three biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
I'd be remiss to say that investment in public transport isn't one of my number one. I think our future of low carbon communities, being able to draw on and amplify space for knowledge intensive economies and have affordable outcomes for housing and access to education and access to retail and leisure activities. The kind of level playing field comes from access, getting access to these offerings within a city. It shouldn't cost you. We should be able to have the equal cost of being able to move around the city. Obviously, there is a cost to taking public transport, but it should be an equal cost across the city. There's that picture of one of the Beatles sitting on a public transport on a train somewhere in the UK, and that is the height of society when all people can take public transport and they feel comfortable and included, and that there is an incentive to take public transport rather than private vehicle, and that it is a place for all cultures to come together. I think that's one of the biggest opportunities, and it's a known. There's lots of research to show the benefits of investing in public transport. There's from social being, the economic benefits that come with public transport really ticks a lot of those boxes. So that would be a big one for me. I think there's a real opportunity to drive more green infrastructure investment as well. Through the data that we have built up over the last couple of years, we understand the role of green infrastructure in our cities, ensuring that we've got resilient waterways and adaptable waterways, ensuring that our ecological and habitat corridors are maintained across the city, the role of canopy tree coverage in ameliorating and mitigating some of the problems we're creating by having intense urban environments. There's another big opportunity there in really driving the green infrastructure investment. I think another major topic, and this comes back to probably the beginning of the conversation, why wasn't economics in the list? It's partnerships, because we've got limited resources. Everybody does, governments, private sector, there are limited resources. But again, pooling those resources for short, medium and long-term returns is critical. And that's a major opportunity. And I think we've seen successes in the past trying to identify those kind of partnership activities that can happen at different scales. It can be a small pocket park. It could be an innovation hub. It could be shared equity on a public transport piece of infrastructure. There is a real opportunity to continue to go down that partnerships pathway. It's one of the major conversations we have on large-scale projects to be able to ensure that there's sustainable funding going forward, and that there's partnerships across government levels, and there's also partnerships between public and private sectors.
Sally Capp in episode 296 talked about public-private partnerships at length because she's a huge proponent of them. Sarah, you have been very generous with your time and answers. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I hope that my role is getting the right people in the room at the right time, I guess. I think it's being able to empower the right people at the right time and contribute to that collaborative process. That's where I am at the moment. Maybe there's a different future that comes along, but that's really where I think my contribution is as a professional. As a citizen, I think it's making choices, sustainable choices on a day-to-day basis. I think it's contributing to that. So Griffiths, electrify everything if I can, if it's within my means. I think it's being active in my community and reaching out to people that I live with, people that I share my community with, and being a part of that. I think an active citizen is probably where I'd like to say my role is, and that's shared between a lot of different people, I think. But I think there is a difference between your professional role and your role as a citizen. From my professional role, I think getting the right people at the table at the right time is really my contribution.
And please keep up this contribution, because it's important to have collaboration and the right people at the right time at the right place to create that collaboration. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I guess my only request would be to think beyond the short-term needs, to really try and engage with those medium and long-term ideas. We're all guilty of being blinded by our short-term returns. And I think that if we can engage on ideas and topics within the city projects that are pushing the boundaries on some of those long-term thinking, that would be my request is let's try and engage with that long-term thinking. And I think that's where some further ingenuity will come as well if we are constantly just trying to get our short-term returns. And I understand the role of those for a sustainable economic pathway to be able to get to the long term. But it is really important to be able to have a conversation as a group of people with those long-term goals in mind.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks, Fanny. It was really great to be here.
It was really interesting to hear from Sarah about public transport as an investment, not to mention her thinking on long-term investments. Andrew Wass explained the difference between cost and value in episode 314. You can find out more about Sarah online, or the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Sarah's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website, where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?